Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. We're here again to get into some really interesting stuff you've shared with us. And, speaking of diving deep, what kind of car does a fish drive?
Oh, no.
An automobile.
Okay. You got me there.
I'm Hari.
And I'm Kimi. Greetings. It's great to be diving in again.
Absolutely. So today we're looking at something pretty specific, right? These old English words.
That's right. We're exploring bæddel and bædling. They pop up in some old medieval text, glossaries, penitentials that listeners sent over.
And the goal here is to sort of unpack what these words might tell us about, well, maybe non-standard ideas about sex or gender back in Anglo-Saxon England.
Exactly. Without getting too bogged down in, super dense academic language.
Yeah.
We want to see what these obscure terms suggest.
So the two main words are bæddel, that's roughly bæddela, and bædling.
And right off the bat, the tricky thing is they don't appear very often. Really limited sources.
Which makes it hard to say exactly what they meant, doesn't it? There's quite a bit of debate among scholars.
For sure. Even whether they meant different things or were, basically synonyms. It's a puzzle.
Okay, so let's start with bæddel. What do the glossaries tell us? Those are like early dictionaries, yeah.
Pretty much. So the Cleopatra glossaries translate the Latin effeminate mollis, which is something like effeminate soft ones using bæddel.
Okay, so an early link to effeminacy, maybe. Lacking typical masculine traits.
That seems to be one angle. But then you look at the Antwerp-London glossaries.
Ah, what do they say?
They use bæddel for the Latin anthroporesis, homooutriosque generis.
Which means?
Anthroporesis, that is, a man of both sexes.
Both sexes. Okay, that's different. More like intersex, maybe?
Potentially. And the Antwerp glossary itself explicitly glosses bæddel as hermaphrodite, and also a man of both sexes. Interestingly, those are the only two direct definitions we actually have for bæddel.
So it's not just effeminate. It could be something about biological sex characteristics, too.
It seems possible. And there's another layer in that same Antwerp glossary from the 11th century. It links bæddel to this incredibly rare word, wepenwijftooi.
Wepenwijftooi. Wow. How's that pronounced again?
Something like WAPN weavefestra. It basically means weapon woman.
Weapon woman.
Yeah.
Like the word wepton man, weapon person, which just meant male.
Exactly. So wepenwijfester might imply a woman with phallic characteristics, or maybe just taking on a masculine weaponed role. It's unique to this one entry, linking it to bæddel.
Fascinating. Okay, what about the other term, bædling?
With bædling, the glosses seem a bit more consistently focused on that idea of effeminacy or softness, often glossed with Latin mollis, soft, or again, effeminate mollis.
So more clearly linked to softness, perhaps.
Generally, yes. Though the Harley glossary throws in another word, carriar.
Carriar. What's the thinking there?
Well, one theory connects it to Caria in Anatolia. There's this legend about a spring there, Salmacis, that supposedly made men effeminate.
Huh. So maybe in association with foreign lands or eunuchs. Weren't they associated with Byzantium, the Orient?
That's the suggested link, yeah.
Yeah.
A bit speculative, but it adds another potential cultural layer,
And the Cleopatra glossaries back in the 10th century also linked bædling to effeminacy.
Yes, they did. Effeminacy and softness. So that connection seems fairly stable across a few sources.
Now, you mentioned penitentials, too, those guides for sin and penance. How do they fit in?
Right. The Old English translation of the penitential Theodori is really interesting here. It actually treats men and bædlings as different categories.
Different categories? How so?
It lists different offenses, different penances for sex between men compared to sex between men and bædlings.
Whoa. So they're seen as distinct groups in the eyes of the church, at least for these rules.
It certainly looks that way.
Yeah.
And it even mentions penance for bædlings having sex with other bædlings.
And how is that described?
It says they are soft like an adulteress, which is, interestingly, a comparison also used for bædels in that Antwerp glossary we mentioned.
Soft, like an adulteress. That's quite specific. And the penitential also says who could be a bædling.
Yes, it mentions both adults and children could be bædlings.
Children, too. Okay, so it wasn't just about adult roles or actions.
Seems not. It suggests it could be seen as a state or identity applicable from a young age.
So, pulling this together, how do scholars try to make sense of bædling specifically? What are the theories?
Well, there are a few ideas floating around. Some suggest maybe people assigned female at birth who lived as men, or possibly intersex people, like one interpretation of bæddel.
Or maybe a kind of third gender category. Outside the male-female binary, we tend to assume.
That's definitely been proposed, or just more broadly, some form of gender nonconformity. It challenges us to think beyond our modern boxes.
What about the sexual aspect? Is it just about being the passive partner?
That's been suggested, yeah, linking to the softness. But like you said, the fact that Bædlings could apparently have sex with each other makes a simple passive partner definition a bit incomplete.
Right, it doesn't quite fit perfectly.
Another possibility is people assigned male at birth who just presented femininely or took on feminine social roles. Again, tying back to that effeminacy theme.
And you mentioned burials earlier, gender non-normative burials.
Yes, some scholars connect these terms to archaeological finds, where, for instance, you find a skeleton identified biologically as male buried with typically female grave goods, like jewelry or weaving tools.
So maybe a link between these linguistic categories and actual lived or at least buried realities.
It's a potential link, though obviously hard to prove definitively. Now, what about where these words come from, the etymology?
Ah, yeah, that's always interesting. Is it true one of them might be related to the word bad?
That's a famous theory. Julius Supitza suggested bæddel was the root of bad, and the OED even supported it for a while. But other ideas have come up since.
Like what?
Well, the linguist Anatoly Lieberman thinks bæddel and bæddling might just be synonyms.
So no real difference in meaning, just variations.
Possibly. And bæddling could just be derived from bæddel with a common suffix like ing or ling. Another scholar, Falk, suggested bæddel comes from a hypothetical Germanic root bæddali, meaning both parts.
Both parts. Like hermaphrodite, similar to other Germanic words.
Exactly. He compares it to words like Danish tveddel, meaning two tools. It fits that man of both sexes gloss quite neatly.
What happened to these words after Old English? Did they just vanish?
Mostly, yes. They seem very obscure later on. There's a mention in the 17th century Scots ballad of a bædling, identified as a sodomite.
And isn't there a dialect word battling up north?
There is, yeah. Northern English dialect bædling, meaning rascal, worthless person, or maybe naughty child. But whether it's truly connected back to the Old English word, that's uncertain. It could be separate.
Are there any other theories about the origin? You mentioned the bad connection isn't certain.
Right. Some link bad, bæddel, and bædling to maybe Gaulish word bædosams, meaning foolish or immoral, or perhaps a lost Old English word bædded, meaning worthless.
So the origin is as debated as the meaning, really.
Pretty much. It seems the adjective bad only really established itself later in Middle English, maybe starting as a nickname.
So here's a fun fact then. Our everyday word bad might have these incredibly deep, complex roots tangled up with ancient ideas about gender and sexuality.
It's a mind-bending possibility, isn't it?
Yeah.
That a simple word carries such hidden history.
So to wrap up, bæddel and bæddling, they're fascinating, even if we can't pin them down completely.
Absolutely. They give us this tantalizing glimpse into how Anglo-Saxons might have understood sex and gender beyond a simple binary. Shows these concepts have a really long, complex history.
Which definitely makes you think, doesn't it? Considering these old terms. How will our own ways of talking about gender and sexuality look to people in the future?
That's a great question. What will future scholars dig up from our language? Food for thought.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure. Always fascinating stuff.
Until next time, everyone, farewell.